everybody. Today we're going to talk about important changes that you need to know about that can happen in ecosystems. So we're going to start off by talking about how stable communities are in the first place. And if you remember when we talked about levels of ecosystem organization, the communities are all of those living things, all the organisms, the plants and animals that are living together. So they can exist at different levels of complexity. And basically, community complexity is the number of species you have at each trophic level and the number of trophic levels you have in a community. So the healthiest communities tend to have really high levels of complexity. These would be really biodiverse communities where you have lots of trophic levels and lots of different species at each of those levels. Those complex communities have really intertwined relationships between the niches of those organisms. So usually these are a little bit more stable because what can happen is you can take one animal away and there's so many other connections that it may not affect the whole community. So community stability relies on three things. First one is constancy, which is how able it is to resist changes in a niche. So this is also kind of part of this term of resistance. Alright, so every time you think of, okay, if it can resist it, it's got high resistance, it's going to resist change. And then we have inertia, which is another way that it can resist change. So here, instead of changes to the niche of the organisms, it's changes from things that could damage the habitat itself. So something like people coming in and doing something in a forest, something like that would be inertia. And then renewal is not resisting change, but once something has actually changed, how much it can bounce back from that. So resilience is another word for renewal. If an environment is very resilient, even if something does change, it's okay, it can recover. So we want our communities to be as stable as possible, which usually means being as biodiverse as possible and having really high resistance and high resilience. And if they are stable, that means that even if all your conditions shift, then the community can recover and you haven't lost those organisms. So biodiversity is really the key to sustainability. You need to keep that biodiversity high so that we have high resistance and high resiliency. And one of the things that we find is that there's a direct impact between environmental stress and biodiversity. You put more stress on an area, the biodiversity goes down. And there's lots of different ways that humans put stresses on the areas that they live in. You can see the highest biodiversity threat areas here are the ones in red. Most of them are in very high population centers, and that is not a coincidence. It's because of all the things that we do in these places that reduces the biodiversity significantly. So one of the things we need to talk about with changes in ecosystems is a process called succession. And you should have been introduced to this in biology, so hopefully this is not all new. But basically, this is where you have species changing over time in a community. So your entire community changes what it looks like over a period of time. And the niche of all those different species changes with it. So there's two types of succession we're going to talk about, primary and secondary succession. And both of those are going to lead us towards what we call a climax community. So there are a couple important vocab words that we need to know here and different types of species that we're worried about. So pioneer species are going to be the species that come in first before anybody else. They're pioneers because they're coming in and starting up the community, just like the pioneers when they went out west. So these guys tend to be really tolerant of different extremes. Since there isn't a community set up there yet, they have to be really hardy to be able to basically set up the whole thing themselves. We haven't talked about R-selected and K-selected species yet because I'm doing this in a little bit different order. But for now, I want you to write this down, and then later on it's going to make more sense what it means. So you tend to have more R-selected species here, and some of those characteristics of those R-selected species that make them good pioneer species is they have really high reproductive rates. So if they can reproduce really quickly, then they're going to colonize the area really easily. They have plants with seeds that spread easily, and because they spread, it's going to kind of take over that whole area. And they're not very good competitors in a more established community. So these are things like grasses that will come in very early on, but once the other plants start to grow taller than them, they don't survive because they can't get the right amount of sunlight. Then we have the other end of the spectrum, which is the climax community. These are the nice stable communities at the end of succession, and these are best suited to those specific environmental conditions at that site. And the K-selected species tend to be the dominant ones in your climax communities. And again, we'll come back to what that is later. But a climax community is basically the end result. And this does not always mean big trees, although we tend to think of them as climax forests. But climax communities can basically be whatever the biome is known for. So if you're talking about a biome that's more of a grassland or prairie biome, then the grasses are the climax community. If you're talking about a desert, then the cacti and all the organisms that live with them is the climax community. So the climax community is whatever that typical biome is. So we have two different types of succession. We have primary and secondary. And basically the difference is in primary succession, you are starting from scratch. There is nothing there. And when I say nothing, I mean there's absolutely no soil. So you're starting with rock. There's no soil, so plants cannot grow in there at all. So usually your pioneer species in this scenario is lichens. And remember, this is a really important mutualistic relationship where an algae is living inside the fungus. The fungus allows the algae to survive, and the algae is providing the fungus with food. Now these guys secrete acid and they break down the rocks that they live on. And that acid breaking it down is really what starts to create the soil. And then as they die, their organic components to their body add to the soil as well and add a lot of nutrients. So this has to happen for a very long time. But eventually, if this happens enough, then mosses start to move in, and then you get other stages, and you start to see the entire pattern of succession take place. This is different from secondary succession because in secondary succession there's still soil there, but something has happened and pretty much all the living things are gone. So it would be after something happens like a forest fire. Everything is burnt to the ground. Nothing is really left alive, but there's still soil. Another one might be after a volcanic eruption, depending on the type and whether or not it put down a new layer of rock. Really, really bad natural disasters could also cause this. Earthquakes, mudslides, even things like hurricanes if they're bad enough. So secondary succession has a similar pattern, but I want you to notice we're starting with some plants all the way at the beginning because we have some soil so the plants can move in from elsewhere. So succession happens in a lot of different biomes and it happens a little bit differently no matter where you are. One of the things I want you to notice is that succession patterns actually really match biome patterns too, in terms of precipitation in particular. And the succession pattern, as I said, is going to vary slightly depending where you are in the world and what that biome actually should be. So here's an example of one around here. And these are actual photographs, but they were not really taken over a long enough period of time to show you exactly what it looks like all the way through because that's not really possible in a human lifetime. But this is basically what it would look like. If you start with bare rock, you have those lichens coming in, they start to make soil. If this happens long enough, you get enough soil, you start to get the mosses, and then once those move out, you start to get some of the grasses coming in. If you keep that going, you get more and more grasses until you get some of the smaller animals that come along with them. You start to see these things called sedges, which are a little bit more bush-like. And then you get to a shrub stage eventually where you have these short plants. These shrubs predominate for a while, more animals start to move in, and then you get to be a young forest. Some of the trees that live here are things like birches, willows that come in first, and then you get further into young forest and into more of a mature forest, and eventually When you have the hardwood trees coming in, you get a climax forest. And there's actually an example of this on the back of your biomagnification packet. So you can kind of look at exactly which types of species you would expect to see in each one of those. Alright, so the same thing could happen after a volcanic eruption. This was Mount St. Helens, and you can see that beforehand we basically had just rock after this volcano had exploded. But this is 20 years later, and you can see it's come back quite a bit, but it's definitely not to that forest stage yet, because the whole process of succession can take hundreds of years. Now, this also happens, as I mentioned, after forest fires. Some ecosystems actually depend on forest fires because they need succession to kind of make the ecosystem healthy and stable again. So some wildlife managers will actually do things called prescribed burns, where they go out and they burn a certain area of the forest. It prevents bigger forest fires, and then it also speeds up this process of succession for the areas that need it. So Yellowstone National Park is a place where this happens naturally on its own all the time. It's not great for the people who live around there, but it is a natural part of the ecosystem. And you can see that after the fire, basically most of your trees were killed, but already you start to see some grasses popping up, and then much later you start to get that young forest again, and it eventually gets back to its climax forest, but it takes quite a long time for that to happen. Now, there are areas where succession cannot happen all the way because of human activity. So the things that we tend to do tends to stall succession more in the weed and shrub stage, or sometimes in the meadow stage, or even less in some cases. So this is part of the problem, is we get in the way of this natural cycle. Another change in ecosystem that's important to know about is the edge effect. So basically, edge habitat is anywhere where two communities are meeting. So grassland and forest is usually the easiest to think about, but it could be a stream in a forest. It could be a lot of different things. And basically, these areas tend to have differences in sunlight and wind, and that changes all these other abiotic factors, and all those abiotic factors will change which species you see there. These edge areas tend to be much more vulnerable to invasive species, and it's actually where you find most of the invasive species. If you go outside and walk and look for them, they will be along these edge areas. And when we take areas and we split them to put roads through or anything like that and increase habitat fragmentation, that increases the edge effect as well. And the problem with that is there's a lot of species that live on the interior of these forested areas or these other habitats, and when you increase the amount of edge, now their habitat has decreased significantly, and the edge habitat has increased by quite a bit too. So this edge habitat is called ecotone, and it's basically talking about how the vegetation changes as you go from one area to another. And it looks pretty similar to the stages of succession in many cases. Now, some of the reasons why this is bad, other than the ones I just mentioned, in certain areas where it's being deforested, forest fires are much more likely in these areas. You have more light, and that means you have a greater understory, and the understory is what's really likely to catch on fire. So in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, this has actually cleared more land than the area that they cleared on purpose in the first place. And it's hard to see all the little red dots, but those are all forest fires. You can definitely see all the smoke coming off of those. So it can really take a bigger toll on the ecosystem to increase the amount of edge. Another example of that here in North America, we talked about a cuckoo. This is a very similar bird, the cowbird, and it's living along the ecotone, and it lays eggs in other birds' nests. So these songbirds along the ecotone tend to die off a lot quicker, be more at risk for extinction because they're being parasitized. The ones on the interior have much better chances. So we're going to continue to talk about changes in ecosystems, and next time we're going to be talking about evolution, because that's of course a natural system of change in ecosystems, and it's something that we want to kind of think about what might happen with it in the future moving forward. Alright, I will see you tomorrow. Have a great night.